Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madhu, and I'm the lead of the safety program at Partnership on AI. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel, unveiling the new model deployment guidance from Partnership on AI. These guidelines represent close to a year of collaborative work across stakeholders from civil society, academia, and industry to establish guidance for the responsible development and deployment of foundation models. And so in preparing for this panel, I decided to check ChatGPT for ideas on a lighthearted welcome that was appropriate for London. And this is what I got. I got, cheerio, everyone. Grab your brolly, because we're about to open a can of worms on AI governance. So it's like, what is brolly? So it's umbrella, I believe. It's umbrella, yeah. So absolutely terrible showing from ChatGPT. I guess that's what the whole Bridge GPT is about. I think that's mythical. You're closer to it. Maybe it's real. Maybe Bridge GPT is happening. I don't know. But what's definitely not terrible is the esteemed panel of experts that we have here today, who are going to spotlight our collaborative journey in developing the model deployment guidance, who are part of the working group and the steering committee that came together to inform and develop this work collaboratively, and unpack the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration in today's context. So I'm going to start with some quick intros. So Andrew, on my right, is an associate director at Ada Lovelace and is responsible for Ada's work addressing emerging technology and industry practice. Thanks for joining us. Joslyn is a senior research scientist at Google DeepMind, working on the long-term strategy and governance team, and a senior research affiliate at the Center for Governance of AI in Oxford. And finally, we have Joelle, who's a vice president in AI research at Meta, and a professor at McGill University. And a special thanks to Joelle for joining us remotely today, despite feeling under the weather. So before kicking off the panel, I want to provide some quick context on the PAI guidance for safe foundation model deployment that we launched today. So you can view the full guidance. It's partnershiponai.org/model deployment. As I said, this was developed through an extensive multi-stakeholder process involving many folks who are here today who participated in working groups and steering committees to shape these guidelines. And I see some of you who contributed. I'm specifically saying Jeremy and Kasia, and perhaps I saw Yolanda at some point. So if you want to wave, these are the people you should find if you have any questions on the guidelines, not me. So there's going to be a couple of terms we'll keep referring to during the panel. So foundation models, which is the current generation of generally capable models designed for broad use cases that don't have to be specifically retrained for specific use cases, and foundation model providers, who are organizations who train the models, who create interfaces to interact with the models, and for developers to build applications on top of. So for legibility's sake, those are our definitions, though I imagine we'll use a lot of other terms that we probably won't define. But a key feature of this work is tailored guidance. So it scales oversight and safety practices based on each model's capabilities and availability. So it's kind of a choose your own adventure. You get to go on the website, choose 1 out of 3 capability types, and from 4 different release approaches. So we also have guidance for when you don't release the model. So even if it's in closed development, we have some good ideas for what you should be doing, like treating your data enrichment workers right, or ensuring that there's no unauthorized access or leaks of the model. And at the core of it, it allows us to update it as the technology progresses. And it kind of accommodates a diversity of models and use cases. So the guidelines, as we've heard many times today, is open for public feedback. But I'm thrilled now to discuss the implications of this collaborative effort. And with that context, we're going to have each panelist share what excited them most about this work. And we're going to start with Andrew first. So which parts of the guidelines especially resonated with you? And what excited you most about their potential?
Thanks so much, Madhu. It's wonderful to be here at a PI event. Last time I was at a PI event was 2020. I was with a completely different company called DeepMind. So it's great to see many new faces and many old ones. I suppose the first thing I'd say is just like it's any kind of multi-stakeholder effort is an incredibly challenging but very important endeavor, right? You are herding cats, but you are herding very opinionated, very busy cats who each have very different incentive structures and represent very different interests, and that is no small feat. So even the fact that you're getting us in the room together is very impressive, and just a massive credit to your team for doing so. I think there's also a kind of point made here about the fact that this is representing a move, slow move, that we hope anyway, towards more of a precautionary approach around these more powerful AI systems, moving away from this kind of disrupt things and hope for the best to something that's trying to create consistent practices to think through the implications of technology before it's released in high-stakes settings. A few things specifically that I'm really grateful to see, and this is reflecting our work as an organization that's really focused on the impacts of AI on different people and different societies. First off is monitoring obligations. So some kind of ex post obligation to assess and identify and monitor what's happening with your system. How is it being used? What kinds of performance differences might be occurring? What are the contexts in which it's being deployed? That's a really wonderful thing. Seeing human rights evaluations anytime in these kinds of voluntary principles is a good thing. As is the notion of ex-ante evaluations and assessment, which I will come to in a minute. I think with evaluations, the big thing there is, what do we mean? What does that term encompass, and what specific practices should that include? I think there is still some things I just want to flag I would like to still see in this document as it moves forward into the next stages for open comment. One is data. There's nothing there about data collection practices, which is, I know, kind of one of the dirty secrets around these models, but feels like an essential one to talk about if we're going to talk about how they should be used responsibly. I think there's another question here about evaluations and what specifically we mean by that term. What kinds of risks will evaluations fit for purpose, and what kinds of things can't be evaluated? What kinds of risks simply need another mechanism in order to assess for them ex ante or ex post? Another is around capabilities. I'm just aware that we talk about dangerous capabilities. That's kind of the term that often gets thrown about. But what about pro-social capabilities? What about the efficacy of these systems? Setting things, for example, like, will this discriminate, or not discriminate against different languages? You know, kind of keeping that sort of center of the way in which we talk about these technologies. And then the last thing I'll just say is really this notion about how we use these kinds of protocols going forward. How are these embedded within different product teams within different large AI companies? I think it's helpful to acknowledge that companies are not a monolith. To borrow a meme from the internet, within every company are two wolves, and these two wolves are constantly fighting, and those wolves are product teams and trust and safety and responsible AI teams. And part of the goal of these kinds of voluntary principles is to empower responsible AI and trust and safety teams so that when push comes to shove, when product incentives come to bear, their needs, their obligations are treated as importantly, if not more importantly, than whatever push to market goals we have. So what we'd like to see next is that this is not happening in a silo. There is certainly a lot here that will kind of inform or shape emerging policy conversations. I think the real question is, how will this be reflected in regulation? What kinds of hard regulatory underpinnings can you give these kinds of principles, these practices, in order to ensure that they are used widely in industry? I will stop there.
I appreciate the call out to key issues that the guidelines should be addressing, but what I truly appreciate is a call out to yourself and your ilk as opinionated cats. I think that's appropriate. You said it, I didn't. So with that, we're going to move to Joelle, keeping up with the theme of reactions to the guidelines that we've all worked on together. So Joelle, I hope you can hear us. But should we move on to Joslyn and we can come back to Joelle? Sorry about that. Yeah. So Joslyn, so I'm going to pose a different question, but a similar question, which is still reactions to the guidelines. Can you discuss the need for iterative approaches and being responsive as capabilities and uses emerge? And how do we balance that agility with establishing norms?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just to back up a little bit, I just wanted to, my engagement with this process started about 6 months ago when, folks at DeepMind were starting to say, we really need to get to concrete best practices. We want to learn from our counterparts in other labs. We want to do this soon. We want to do it, in a very, focused way, and PAI was very responsive to that. And so I've tracked this process throughout, and I'm very excited about where we have started with this. In essence, these guidelines provide us a powerful framework for thinking about different forms of models and how we should be thinking about them differently, right? And so the framework as it is now, it builds on this iterative approach, as she's saying, and the idea that, with increasingly powerful models comes added safety responsibility, right? And so, sorry, this very odd. Is it echoing to no? Okay, sounds weird. So I think that that's absolutely right. I think we have to think about, as those developers who are pushing at the frontier, they're adding new capabilities, new modalities, new, essentially exploring new scale. Essentially, what sort of onus does that put on developers to do extra safety mitigation, safety assessments, et cetera? So I think having this kind of scaled approach makes a lot of sense. I think that, in this sense, we, as we try to figure out what we should be developing, what we should be deploying, we should be doing model evaluations. As Andrew said, we have a lot of work to do there, but we can discuss that. So, we should be drawing on evidence from, model evaluations, external, internal red teaming, various forms of expert evidence that we can draw on to figure out how we should develop and deploy. I think that, that is far from an exact science. And so I think that we are, again, at the beginning of this process. We're going to have to draw a lot of different minds, modes of expertise into this to be able to figure out what exactly optimal iteration means. And I think we have a great starting point. But I think that, we have a long way to go, as Andrew suggested, about, are we evaluating for the right things? How do we know we're effectively evaluating for those things? How do we know that we have found all potential risks? So there's a lot of work to do there. And then from that, how do we scale from those evaluation results into actual mitigation strategies and governance implications? And so you have this very large, complicated framework. We can act as though it's kind of there's a lot of scientific work to be done here. I think that's true. But as already has been kind of suggested, there's also, a political process here in the sense that we all get to weigh in. Hopefully, in an ideal world, we'd all be able to weigh in and think about what levels of risk we're all comfortable with. And so we have to figure out how also to incorporate a wide range of perspectives on that. Just to say that there's, I see this as an incredible start, but it's going to be a long, hard road, essentially, of continual cat herding. And I think that, but that's the only way. I see a lot of similarity between the iterative approach that we need for models to the process that we essentially will engage in within this exercise and all similar exercises attempting to put together similar frameworks. There's nothing static about this process. The entire field is moving, and we're going to have to continually evolve, continually update how we think about best practice. And so I think that's an incredible challenge. So again, this is a start of an excellent working relationship that we'll need to hone over time and develop processes to figure out how to evolve and adapt to an ever-changing system.
Thanks, Joslyn. I think that's a useful call out to the subtitle of this effort, which is it's a framework for collective action. Another way of thinking about it, as you rightly pointed out, it's an opening statement for a working relationship. So the work can't cease to end by any means, but holding ourselves accountable publicly to a set of things that we hold as valuable is one way to openly kind of have this conversation and bring other people in. So with that, I'm going to see if we can get Joelle on. So we're going to move on and give our AV team another chance at this, only because Joelle is so great and we want to hear from her. Or we're going to have her email her remarks to all of you, which should be pretty awkward. Okay, so with that, moving on to the next question, Andrew. So we're kind of departing from the theme of the guidelines itself and thinking more broadly about different, kind of open questions in this space. So why is it, in your view, do you think it's important to have a diversity of AI models and deployment scenarios, including open source deployment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the emerging things we're trying to grapple with is what do different release methods, how might different release methods correlate with different kinds of risks? So if you're putting something out, sort of throwing it over the wall in a research capacity online with no real testing or awareness or control over how people might use it, that could lead to certain kinds of harms that might not occur if you keep something closed in-house. Now, I really want to emphasize, I think I'm perhaps not as firm a believer in some of the concerns there as others might be. My slight concern is that we focus too much on capabilities of these systems or modalities of these systems to determine how much risk they pose. I don't really know what that term means, capabilities. Are we talking about whether it can juggle? Because I would argue that if juggling is a capability, probably what's more important is the context in which it's being used. So where is it being integrated? Where is it being put into use? For example, it's a difference if something can juggle with chainsaws in a crowded playground versus if it's juggling with softballs in an open field, right? That's a very significant difference in terms of where something's being used. So for me, I suppose that's where I see a lot of risk coming up. And that's not just unique to frontier models, that's unique to any kind of AI system. We use AI in all kinds of high-stakes settings at the moment, oftentimes with very low risk assessment, ex-ante evaluations. So I see a lot of the fantastic features of this protocol, these policies, as being quite useful for other kinds of settings beyond just frontier AI. Now, I'm not saying that open source, the most cutting edge models, is a good idea. I don't want to tie my flag to that post, but I suppose I'm just, my kind of question is that we're really focused at the moment on this narrative of capabilities being the source of danger, and I'm not so convinced that's the right place for us to focus. I think a lot of regulation needs to really keep the eye on the ball for the context of use, the ways in which these are being integrated, amongst a whole suite of other questions. Who's involved in these kinds of evaluations? Who is having the right of refusal for these kinds of evaluations or these kinds of uses? But it is useful nonetheless to make that distinction.
Yeah, that's a helpful call out that we went with like a bi-directional framework. So we identified two kind of variables, which is the release type and the capability type. And this is something we heard even recently, Lama, if I'm allowed to quote you, but another axis is the use type or the use case. Where is it being used? And that's not something we got to at this stage. In part, I think we need more transparency about how these models are being used. And that's something we call for right now. We call for transparency reports. I think there's a presumption that even with open source releases, we know exactly how those models are being used. But I think across the board, we need more transparency, both around model usage and also around policy violations. But of course, there are trade-offs to consider when you reveal that kind of information. But Joslyn, I'm curious if you want to jump in on diversity of deployment scenarios and why it's important.
I guess with uncertainty, right, we know these models have, as we scale them, as we add modalities, as we add things like, things that may be coming down the pike, memory, tool use, planning, right, we have to be thinking about what risks are out there that we aren't yet able to fathom. We haven't predicted. The developers have not yet predicted them. And so for me, I think it's, the onus is on us to address not only the harms that we already know exist, but also to be continually scanning for those who are at that frontier, to be thinking about what could be coming. As we increase capabilities, and I agree, of course, capabilities is a very rough proxy, and I think that we still need to do a lot more work to figure out what that means. I think this need to focus and identify ex ante what sorts of models could pose the greatest risks. We end up back at capabilities because that's the thing that's easiest to measure. That is far from perfect. Again, this is something we will have to continually iterate as we learn more about what features of models pose the most risk. So completely agree with Andrew on that. It's just a place to start, right? I think that ultimately, if we were really, we would draw the smallest circle around those models that pose the most risks, but we simply don't know what those are yet. And so I think, that's kind of my view of this, is that absolutely not useful in the long run, but is a starting place in essence to focus on capabilities. But I'm not sure.
No, I feel like you're going to hear the word starting point a lot, both in this panel and if you want to catch us after. And that's only because it's doing a grave injustice if we were to act like it's a solved problem. It's far from a solved problem. But starting points need a rebrand. Starting points are great. It allows for other people to participate if there is a starting point. But again, it's not a solved problem by any stretch. And that's what's so exciting about the work that's ahead of us. Jocelyn, I'm going to go back to you again. Since we're in this conversation about capabilities that Andrew very rightly threw us in, what frontier capabilities and modalities do you think warrant particular governance attention? And I heard some of it already, but if you want to get specific, why focus on potential or emerging risks in addition to current harm?
Yeah. In addition to is the important aspect of what you said there. We should be obviously, this is an additive thing. This is not mutually exclusive in any possible way, right? So we know that these things are already producing some harms. It is on us as, developers to essentially, assess those harms and figure out mitigation strategies and to assess what could be coming down the pike. As we increase capabilities, there is a chance, we don't know for sure, but there is a chance that we will then also increase the scale of potential harms. And so we actually need to have more foresight. We need to be essentially engaging with potential assessments and mitigation strategies earlier in the development process. And so certainly, the uncertainty will expand as we include things like memory and horizon scanning and tool use. And so it's more about, these risks may not emerge, and that would be amazing, but they might, and we need to be prepared for them. At that, at the frontier of innovation essentially comes added responsibility and an onus on developers to engage in that development with caution. And so I think that, the answer is we don't know. We do know that, we already see some evidence that models could provide, enhanced weapons capabilities, capacities, nuclear, potentially. We don't have, resolutions for these things. So obviously we need to be thinking about what could come down the pike. So I think that's, my notion is that there is no either or, it is just purely additive. And we'll get to the magic wand question later, in which we talk about, how we talk about harms more broadly, but I'll finish my thought then.
I did send around a panel prep doc, so that's kind of what you're preempting. But Andrew, curious if you want to jump in. Are there specific modalities that you're thinking about? There's this whole kind of over-rotating on capabilities, which might be unhelpful, but if you want to take on frontier capabilities and use cases that concern you, what's that combination that's terrifying?
Yeah, I'll avoid the cop-out answer, which is what I do believe, which is all. I think they're all are very important. But I suppose if I had to pick a couple, I think as the DeepMind paper that just was released earlier this week showed, which I think is a fantastic paper about socio-technical evaluations of these systems, there's a real lack of evaluations for non-text modalities. So we just have nothing really out there at the moment for image, for video, for audio. And I suppose what I see is like the kind of really challenging risk. You think about like the one that has the most, the biggest gap between how prepared we are as a society for it and then how quickly the capabilities are becoming widely distributed. It's that multimodal function. It's that ability for generating of images, video, audio to a high degree of power. And I'm not thinking about that in a misinformation or disinformation context. I think that's perhaps a bit overblown. I'm thinking about that more from a right to image and reputation context, about how much do we control what people understand or know about us. That to me feels like something that I see a real gap in our law for many jurisdictions. Data protection might cover some of that, but in the US, certainly not. I think there's perhaps a new era there. And then the other is just thinking about how that's used. It's shocking to me that some of the most immediate applications of this have been for non-consensual sexual imagery, which is exactly what we learned with deepfakes the last time we went through this. So there is a real gendered aspect to these harms that I think we can't ignore, that I feel like is at the moment kind of being pushed to the side in the policy discussions in favor of kind of long-term misuse or loss of control risks. I suppose I would like to see that more centered and to think about how modalities are impacting or connected to those kinds of risks.
Yeah, I think you very fairly captured that combination. It's the way we define frontier models currently in the guidelines. Out of it's an extremely large multimodal model, which I think you're alluding to, Andrew. And also if it's a model that can execute a command on the internet or an action in the real world. And again, this is just us trying to future-proof this work, thinking about what's coming next. And what you kind of rightly pointed out, thinking beyond interfaces as we now know them, but interfaces that can look fairly different and perhaps more capable. I'm not sure we've gotten Joelle back. Oh. we lost her virtually, to clarify. And that's sad, because I think would have loved to hear from her, especially on open source deployment, but there's another day that we can pick up on that for all of you. So the next set of questions I have for both of you is, and this kind of goes to the use case question, Andrew, which is, as capabilities advance, how can we ensure downstream users or application developers uphold responsible AI norms inherited from upstream design choices? I feel like that's going to be the question of the hour. Who is responsible? And I imagine we'd be hearing a lot about that. But especially from a public sector use point of view, that Ada Lovelace has been thinking a lot about.
Yeah, it's a really hard question. I mean, I think this is in part touching on liability, so who's liable for the ultimate end use, and then also a question about a control or knowledge, who actually understands, sees, can control the downstream use to the best effect. I suppose one thing that I've heard proposed, Jenny Tennyson had, I don't think is here, but she had a really wonderful point about thinking about food and food safety liability, where kind of the liabilities on end users ultimately, and that kind of commits like an upstream surge of safety obligations. So a downstream user, grocer would then say, well, I'm only going to buy from providers who can guarantee a high degree of safety, sort of distribution centers and others. But I don't think that works with what we're talking about here, right? There's a real lack, imbalance of power in the dynamic we have in this sector, where you have a few large providers who are providing a centralized service, and they can offer take it or leave it contracts. This is something we talk about in our accountability paper on supply chains. So that raises then a bigger question of how do you find that level of liability or responsibility for different actions within the ways in which these systems will be deployed and used. I suppose one key thing is you need transparency up and down a supply chain. That's something that we absolutely need to create, and I'm very happy to see that some of the protocols are trying to enable this, the notion of creating systems cards, transparency sheets, even in some cases access to training data in some particular use cases. That I think is an essential component for how to sell. Another, I think, is this question of contractual obligations, so that if you are going to downstream use a particular service, you need to commit to certain kinds of audits, assessments, evaluations downstream to ensure that it's being used in a proper way. But at the end of the day, I think really what we also need is not going to come from voluntary policies. It's going to come from strong regulators who can tell us where are the no-go red lines for some of these applications. I'm not expecting any company to avoid building a very persuasive agentic system that wants to pretend that it's Taylor Swift and ask you about very personal details about your life, to use a very topical example. I would expect a regulator to step in and say, that's not okay. You're encouraging sort of an over-reliance on a agentic system for sharing very personal private information. So I do think there's a question there about how do you get regulators in that position where they feel confident making those calls, but also the powers to do that. And that is why we desperately need regulation in this space to increase regulatory powers. I'm very grateful that the EU AI Act is trying to address this. We have emerging regulation in the UK, proposals here, and the US has several bills that are offering, again, some different ideas for how you can enable that type of power. But with that also comes a regulatory muscle, the sort of willingness to engage in a more precautionary approach as a regulator, which is something that I don't think we have in this space. Pro-innovation narratives really push against that. It makes any attempt to draw red lines seem as though you're somehow against progress. That is toxic to all of us. I really can't stress that enough. We cannot encourage that kind of mindset, because that's how really bad things happen, and then the whole field suffers. So the more that we can identify those red lines, those use cases, the more that we can enable and empower regulators to be in that kind of position, the more that we can encourage that kind of precautionary approach collectively, not just from civil society or from government, but also from industry. I think the better off we'll be in creating those conditions.
Yeah, I feel like the Taylor Swift example was awfully specific. I mean, that's a model evaluation for you, Joslyn. Taylor Swift phishing scams. It seems fairly specific. I think you're going to get working on it right now. But no, Andrew, seriously, I think that's something we're very clear with the guidelines, that we're looking to complement regulation, not replace regulation, and that we need more avenues to coordinate expectations if we want to advance accountability. And I think red lines is an important question, and it has to be subject to democratic debate. And that's where regulation is ideally where that should emerge from. So yeah, that's an important flag. But if I'm just going to flip that question and pose the same question to you, Joslyn, essentially, even as we're thinking about the value chain, one specific question I imagine you might be faced with is what feedback mechanisms are critical between different links in the value chain if you're thinking about emerging risks and to collectively identify those.
So I think that this notion that we need to establish red lines is clear, right? It goes back to this notion of, again, we're going to have these model evaluations. What do we do with them? They're going to give us a lot of subjective information. We act as though somehow this is going to give us some sort of clear binary indication of what to do. It's not. So we need to have this collective process by which we feed in to say, this is the level of risk, right? And that's going to be, again, this kind of process that we all need to feed into, decide. We're going to have disagreements about that, as we do with many, many different societal issues. And that's going to take a long time. But so I think that there are different, this notion of where we get feedback within the systems. I think we should be doing that across the development and deployment phase, right? I think we should do this, obviously, developers, the onus is on us to do these assessments before we put powerful models out into the world, and then we need post-deployment monitoring to get feedback from, the systems that these models are in, products, et cetera. How do we essentially engage external red teaming communities in order to give us useful feedback? How do we protect them so that they can give us feedback that, that we act on? And what do we do with that feedback? And once we get it inside of labs. So I think we just have so many different questions about how to draw the right information, how to be confident it is the right information, and then what do we do with that information? So sorry to go back to, again, the starting point, but yes, I'm afraid that is still where we are. Back to this notion of definitions, though, I think it's pretty shocking how many of these conversations, we're just starting at this beginning, right? In essence, we can't build a science of these things until we're speaking in the same language, and we haven't been. The labs have not really been talking to each other in any sort of serious way about well, how do you guys think about X, Y, and Z, right? How do you think about model transparency? How do you think about model cards? So we haven't even had those conversations so that we could get onto the same page and start having a kind of cumulative discussion, which is how knowledge advances, right? We learn from each other. We learn how we're thinking about things, we argue, and we hopefully converge to some sort of, common view of things. And so, yeah, I just think that this is the nature of things as it has to be. But, yeah.
What are the voices that we're still not hearing from enough? I can imagine that's a long list. So I'd say short list, maybe 3 key audiences or lesser. We don't have to get that prescriptive, but who do you think we're not hearing from enough in this space? Call it AI ethics or AI safety, and whose perspectives should be more strongly included? That's a question for both of you.
I don't think we have even the infrastructure or processes in place for engaging with any publics, really, within the tech industry. One of the papers we just did was looking at public participation approaches in tech companies, and it finds what you suspect. There's no really consistent standards or practices. These are very ad hoc. These are often used often very easily with the best intentions. They can still be used in quite tokenistic ways, either to ask the wrong set of questions, to change the answer after the fact. There's no real obligation to follow up with many people after the fact. And it gets back to this fundamental problem when we talk about evaluations or any kind of sort of inclusive evaluations, any kind of project that involves the tech industry, who hold great power in these positions, enormous power, from engaging with civil society or other publics, whether that's people in a particular area, whether that is doctors who might be using the product, whether that is teachers or perhaps even parents of students who might be impacted by this project. And that is oftentimes public engagement requires ceding power. You need to give up power in those positions. You need to be accountable to the publics that you're engaging with. You need to respond directly to what they're asking, and you need to take into account very carefully what they are doing and show that you've listened, show that you've taken action on it. I think we still are really struggling with creating that kind of practice and creating that as a muscle that we can use regularly I say I came from the tech industry. I'm not in there anymore. I gotta keep in mind that in your work. And crucial with that, again, is that question that David and others hit on earlier of incentives. How do you incentivize this? This is so hard. We had a discussion the other day about how do you encourage tech companies and teams within tech companies who really want to do this work? And I think it comes with both sort of a leadership commitment to this kind of a practice, and internal accountability practices to really be transparent about what these efforts are showing, making sure you're using them in early stages of work, not after the fact, to talk with educators after you've already launched your product. Those to me feel like really basic practices, but another one that is even more challenging is how do you avoid this being extractive and exploitative of the communities that you're trying to work with? I find this the most challenging thing when we talk about public engagement in the tech industry, because at the end of the day, you're just trying to make a product better than your competitor. That's oftentimes what the incentive is. And so that's not what most publics want. Most publics don't want you to have a fancier, schmancier chat GPT. When we talk to publics, they want a doctor, not an app. When we talk to publics, they want a teacher for their students who understands their needs, not some kind of personalized computer system that doesn't really know who they are. So that, to me, is the hard part about asking members of the tech industry to do this work and to engage with members of the public. I think it presents a major challenge in terms of how you do your work. At the very least, I'd like us to be honest about that challenge, because if we can't be honest about that, we really can't make any progress. But the other question I'd ask is, what incentives externally do we need? Is this, again, somewhere, I'm going to harp on it again, where regulation and law can help support that? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not going to pretend that I do, but I just want to share. To me, I see that as one of the most wicked problems that we're facing right now. And I genuinely don't quite know where to go with it, but I'm really excited to work with you all to try to address it. And I'm aware that Tina from PAI is doing so much of this work already. It's fantastic that initiative exists.
I mean, we had this in our working group discussions as well. This kind of risk of participant washing is a real risk. So even in the guideline around enabling feedback across the AI value chain, we identify that you should have mechanisms to collect feedback, and then you should address the feedback in the deployment. And they're almost two different activities. It's like me buying books and reading them. I've learned it the hard way. They're not the same activity. So collecting feedback, addressing feedback, I think are widely, I think just getting that muscle, training that muscle of addressing feedback within product life cycles is perhaps something that's, again, part of a framework for collective action. It's definitely not solved. But Joslyn, if you want to jump in.
I think that yes, we need processes internally. I think that goes a long way to kind of establishing routine. I think that it's hard to argue at the time, right? We need to actually, within really large companies like Google, someone said earlier, there's many, many different Googles, right? And so I think there's a notion of, it's a lot of time and effort for those who are arguing for responsibility to argue that in a novel circumstance every day without some sort of real structure behind them. And so just, this, but back to the question of like, how do we incorporate these voices? There are so many voices that we need to be incorporating. This needs to be a much more international discussion. It's wonderful that groups like PAI are starting to push in that direction. It's wonderful that the UK government is starting to draw countries from, a wide range of geographies, and all of that is excellent. I think that at least on the company level, there's a question of, how do we embed these expectations? How do we do that? And I think that just gets back to the guidelines, the PAI guidelines. The closer we can get to things like actual checklists, implementation guidelines. So it's very clear internally, and we don't have to spend lots of kind of corporate inefficiencies in deriving what these expectations are. So, there's these questions about like, is this just an effort at self-regulation, right, and things like this? And my answer is always, if you're embedded in these companies, you see how much incredible inefficiency and time is spent trying to coordinate across all of these people to decide what responsibility means. And so that is just, we don't actually have an incentive to be doing this. We want organizations like PAI and other external organizations to be helping us with these things. It is actually in our interest to have organizations like this figure these things out. And so back to this question of how should we be incorporating voices and whose voices should we be incorporating? I think that this is exactly the role that PAI can play in helping us provide very clear guidelines. Again, getting out of the high level, because we don't, then we again have to interpret it. We all have to figure out what it means, and maybe the different labs are going to interpret in different ways, and then there'll be a process of retrofitting whatever it meant as standards move on. This is not efficient for us. And so, the more kind of fine-grained implementation guidelines, the better, as long as we're all kind of inputting and going through the hard work of figuring out exactly what those should be, the better.